What would you do if you discovered your own family had been forging your signature to steal your house through fake loan applications? Would you confront them immediately? Call the police? Or would you do what I did? Let them think their plan was working while I prepared the most devastating counterattack of their lives. My name is Betty White, and at 60 years old, I thought I understood the depths of human greed and betrayal. I'd raised my son Marcus as a single mother after his father died when he was 12, working 2 jobs to keep our house and put him through college. I'd sacrificed vacations, new clothes, and countless personal dreams to give him every opportunity I never had. What I didn't expect was that 30 years later, he would repay that sacrifice by trying to steal the very roof over my head. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. I was in my kitchen, making the coffee that had become my quiet ritual since Marcus and his wife Jennifer had moved in 6 months earlier, when the phone rang with that particular urgency that always made my heart skip. Mrs. Betty White. The voice was professionally cheerful, the kind that banks train their employees to use when discussing large sums of money. Yes, this is Betty. This is Marcia Coleman from Pacific Trust Bank. I'm calling to confirm your application for a home equity line of credit. We've received your initial paperwork, but we're missing a few documents to complete the $250,000 loan approval. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and hot liquid. $250,000? I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I never applied for any loan. The cheerful tone faltered. Ma'am, we have your completed application right here, signed and dated last Wednesday. You applied for a home equity line against the property at my address, my house. The house I'd owned free and clear for 15 years. I need to see this application, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Can I come to the bank today? An hour later, I was sitting in a sterile conference room, staring at documents that made my blood run cold. There was my name, printed in block letters, my social security number, my date of birth, my employment history, and at the bottom, a signature that was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. Oh, it was close. Someone had studied my handwriting, practiced the curves of my B and the loop of my W. But I'd been signing my name for 60 years, and I knew every stroke, every flourish. This signature had been forged by someone who had access to examples of my real signature, someone who had watched me write, someone who lived in my house. Mrs. White, Marcia said gently, if you didn't sign this application, then we need to contact the fraud department immediately. This is a serious federal crime. Not yet, I said, still staring at the papers. Can you tell me exactly what this loan would do? Marcia pulled out another set of documents. The applicant requested a $250,000 line of credit against your home's equity. Based on our assessment, your property is worth approximately $400,000, so the loan amount is within acceptable parameters. The funds would be available immediately upon approval. And who would have access to these funds? According to the application, both you and... She checked the papers. Marcus White, who's listed as a co-applicant, and your son. My son. My son had forged my signature to steal $250,000 from my own house, money that would give him immediate access to funds I'd never agreed to borrow, secured by the home I'd spent decades paying for with my own sweat and sacrifice. But here's what made it even worse. I recognized the handwriting on the application form itself. The neat, precise printing that filled out my personal information belonged to Jennifer, my daughter-in-law. This wasn't a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned theft that both of them had participated in, using my trust and my home against me. Mrs. White, are you all right? Marcia asked, probably noticing that I'd gone very still and very pale. I'm fine, I lied. Can I get copies of all these documents? Of course, but I really think we should involve law enforcement. I'll handle it, I interrupted, though I had no idea how. Just please don't approve this loan, and don't contact the applicants until you hear from me. I drove home in a daze, the copied loan documents sitting on the passenger seat like evidence of a murder. Which, in a way, they were. They were evidence of the murder of my trust, my sense of family, my belief that the people I'd sacrificed everything for would never deliberately hurt me. But by the time I pulled into my driveway on the property that was mine, paid for with money I'd earned through decades of honest work, the shock was transforming into something much more dangerous. Cold, calculated fury. Marcus and Jennifer thought they were dealing with a confused, trusting old woman who wouldn't notice or understand what they were doing to her. They thought that 6 months of making me feel like a guest in my own home had softened me up enough to make me an easy target for their financial fraud. They had no idea that this 60-year-old woman had spent 30 years as a legal secretary, working for attorneys who specialized in real estate fraud and family law. They didn't know that I'd seen dozens of cases exactly like this one, and I knew exactly how they ended. They didn't know that I had contacts in the legal system, experience with documentation, and a comprehensive understanding of exactly what crimes they'd committed and what evidence would be needed to prove it. Most importantly, they had no idea that their victim was about to become their worst nightmare. I sat in my car for another few minutes, watching my house, the house with the mortgage I'd paid off 5 years early, the house where I'd raised my son as a single mother, the house that represented every sacrifice I'd ever made. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them immediately. I wasn't going to call the police right away. I was going to let Marcus and Jennifer continue their plan while I gathered evidence, documented their crimes, and prepared a response that would not only stop their theft, but ensure they could never try anything like this again. They wanted to play games with my property, my signature, and my trust? Fine. But they were about to learn that this particular game had rules they didn't understand and consequences they hadn't considered. I walked into my house, with a smile on my face and documents in my purse that would change everything. Marcus and Jennifer were in the living room, watching television like they didn't have a care in the world, like they hadn't just committed multiple felonies against the woman who'd given them a roof over their heads. "How was your morning, Mom?" Marcus asked without looking away from the screen. "Very educational," I replied. "I learned some things today that I think we'll all find very interesting." If they had looked at me then, really looked, they might have noticed something different in my expression, something that should have warned them their little fraud scheme was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. But they didn't look. They were too busy planning how to spend my money to pay attention to the woman they were stealing it from. Their loss. My advantage. And the beginning of a very expensive lesson about why you should never underestimate the woman whose house you're trying to steal. That evening, after Marcus and Jennifer had gone to bed in what they'd started calling their room, the master bedroom of my house, which they'd gradually taken over without ever asking permission, I began the most important investigation of my life. 30 years of working for Brennan and Associates, one of the city's most respected real estate law firms, had taught me exactly how financial fraud cases were built, what evidence was needed to prosecute them, and most importantly, how families destroyed each other over money when they thought they could get away with it. I'd seen it all. Children forging parents' signatures on deeds, spouses stealing equity from marital homes, business partners creating fake loans to embezzle company assets. What Marcus and Jennifer had attempted wasn't original. It was textbook fraud that followed patterns I'd documented in dozens of legal cases. But understanding the crime was only the first step. If I wanted to stop them permanently, I needed to build a case that would not only prevent the loan fraud, but expose every other financial manipulation they'd been planning. I started with my own house, searching for evidence of their preparations. In the spare bedroom where they kept their computer, I found a folder tucked behind their printer, labeled Financial Planning. Inside were documents that made my hands shake with rage, printed emails from mortgage brokers, research on home equity loans, and most damning of all, practice sheets where Jennifer had been copying my signature. Sheet after sheet of lined paper filled with attempts to replicate my handwriting. Early attempts that were clumsy and obvious, followed by increasingly sophisticated forgeries that showed hours of dedicated practice. At the bottom of one sheet, Jennifer had written a note to herself. Betty's signature. Softer on the B. Sharper angle on W. Remember the loop. They hadn't just decided to steal from me on a whim. They'd been planning this for months, studying my handwriting, researching loan options, preparing for a systematic theft of my home's equity. But the signature practice sheets were nothing compared to what I found next. A detailed plan, written in Marcus's handwriting, outlining their complete financial strategy. Phase 1: establish residence and reduce mom's independence. Make her dependent on us for daily tasks. Phase 1. They'd moved into my house not to help me, or because they needed temporary shelter, but as the first step in a calculated plan to steal my assets. Every act of kindness, every offer to help with grocery shopping or bill paying, had been designed to make me more dependent on them and less likely to notice their eventual theft. Phase 2. Gain access to financial information and normalize our involvement in mom's money management. That explained Marcus's sudden interest in helping me with my mail, his offers to organize my important papers, Jennifer's casual questions about my bank accounts and investment statements. They'd been gathering intelligence, learning about my assets and financial habits so they could better exploit them. Phase 3. Secure home equity loan using mom's signature. Initial amount $250K, with option to increase if successful. If successful. As if stealing $250,000 from their mother and landlord was just the beginning of their plans. Phase 4. Establish financial control through power of attorney. If mom shows signs of confusion or resistance. Power of attorney. They were planning to have me declared incompetent if I discovered their theft, using the legal system to gain complete control over my assets, while making it look like they were protecting a confused elderly woman. But the final item on their list was what made me understand the true scope of their betrayal. Phase 5. Long-term care placement if necessary to maintain control of property. They were planning to put me in a nursing home, not because I needed care, not because I was unable to live independently, but because removing me from my own house would give them complete control over my property and my money. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands steadier than they'd been all day. Anger, I'd learned from my years in legal work, was much more useful when it was cold and focused rather than hot and emotional. The next morning, I called Patricia Chen, an attorney I'd worked with for 15 years before my retirement. Patricia specialized in elder fraud and family financial crimes, exactly what Marcus and Jennifer had stumbled into. "Betty, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this," Patricia said after I'd explained the situation and sent her photos of the evidence. "But I have to say, the documentation you've gathered is extraordinary. Most victims of family financial fraud don't realize what's happening until after the money is gone. 30 years of working fraud cases teaches you what to look for," I replied. "What I need to know is how to stop them without just causing a family explosion that ends with everyone in court. Betty, they've already committed multiple felonies: forgery, attempted fraud, identity theft. The family explosion is inevitable. The question is whether you control it or they do." Patricia was right, of course. But I wasn't ready to blow up my relationship with my son without giving him one chance to understand exactly what he'd done and make it right. "Can you help me document everything properly while I decide how to handle the confrontation?" "Absolutely. But Betty, you need to understand that every day you wait is another day they might try a third approach. If they realize you're on to them, they might accelerate their timeline or try to have you declared incompetent." That afternoon, I made one more discovery that confirmed my worst suspicions. Hidden in Jennifer's jewelry box, underneath a tangle of cheap necklaces, I found business cards from 2 different elder care facilities and a brochure titled "When It's Time, Making the Decision for Memory Care." They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were researching where to warehouse me when I became inconvenient to their plans. That night at dinner, I watched my son and his wife make small talk about their day, discussing television shows and weekend plans like they were normal people, instead of criminals who were planning to destroy my life for money. "Marcus," I said during a lull in conversation, "I've been thinking about estate planning lately. Do you think I should consider updating my will?" I watched his reaction carefully, the slightest tightening around his eyes, the quick glance he exchanged with Jennifer, the forced casualness of his response. That's probably a good idea, Mom. You want to make sure everything is organized properly. I was thinking about adding some provisions for long-term care, in case I ever need help managing my affairs. This time, Jennifer jumped in. That's very wise, Betty. It's important to plan ahead for those situations. They thought I was making their job easier, giving them openings to suggest power of attorney arrangements and financial management services. They had no idea I was testing them, documenting their responses, and preparing for a confrontation that would expose not just their attempted theft, but their complete lack of remorse for what they were planning to do to me. After dinner, I sat in my bedroom with Patricia's business card in my hand and made a decision. I was going to give Marcus one opportunity to confess, apologize, and make things right. If he chose honesty and family loyalty, we might be able to salvage something from this betrayal. But if he chose to continue lying, to keep pretending that his fraud was justified or that I was too old and confused to understand what he was doing, then I was going to show him exactly what happened when you tried to steal from someone who understood the legal system better than you did. Tomorrow morning I would find out which version of my son I was really dealing with, the boy I'd raised to have integrity and respect for others, or the criminal who'd been forging my signature while sleeping in my house. Either way, their game was about to end. The only question was whether it would end with forgiveness or with felony charges. The next morning, I woke before dawn and sat in my kitchen with coffee and the weight of decisions that would change our family forever. By 7 a.m., I'd made up my mind about how this would play out. I waited until Marcus and Jennifer were both awake and having their breakfast, the breakfast I'd paid for, in the kitchen I owned, at the table I'd bought with money I'd earned, before I pulled out the manila folder containing everything I'd discovered. I need to discuss something important with both of you, I said, setting the folder on the table between us. Marcus looked up from his cereal. Sure, Mom. What's up? I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, the copy of the fraudulent loan application with my forged signature. I received an interesting phone call from Pacific Trust Bank yesterday, I said, watching their faces carefully. They wanted to confirm my application for a $250,000 home equity loan. The change in the room was immediate. Marcus went very still, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Jennifer's coffee cup paused in midair, frozen like she'd been caught in a photograph. The problem is, I continued, I never applied for any loan, so I went to the bank to see what they were talking about. I spread the loan documents across the table, the forged signature visible at the bottom of each page. Someone has been forging my name using my personal information and attempting to steal $250,000 from my home's equity. That someone had to have access to my social security number, my employment history, and examples of my handwriting. Marcus set down his spoon, but he didn't meet my eyes. Mom, there must be some mistake. The mistake, I interrupted, pulling out the next set of documents, was leaving the evidence where I could find it. I placed Jennifer's signature practice sheets on the table, page after page of my name, written over and over in increasingly accurate forgeries. Jennifer's face had gone completely white. Betty, I can explain. You can explain why you spent hours practicing to forge my signature, I asked. You can explain why you researched home equity loans without telling me. You can explain why you filled out a fraudulent loan application using my identity. Now I pulled out the final piece of evidence, Marcus's handwritten plan, with its phases of financial manipulation and long-term control. Or maybe Marcus can explain this detailed strategy for stealing my assets, gaining control of my finances, and eventually placing me in a nursing home so you can have complete access to my property. Marcus stared at his own handwriting like he'd never seen it before. Mom, it's not what it looks like. It looks like conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, identity theft, and elder abuse, I said. Because that's exactly what it is. I stood up, looking down at two people who had been planning to destroy my life for money, and I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete clarity about who they really were. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You have exactly one opportunity to tell me the truth about what you've been planning, why you thought stealing from me was acceptable, and how you intend to make this right. Marcus finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't shame or remorse. It was calculation. He was trying to figure out how to talk his way out of this, how to minimize the damage, how to convince me that their theft was somehow justified. Mom, you have to understand, we were trying to help. Your house is your biggest asset, but it's just sitting here not generating any income. We thought if we could access some of the equity, we could invest it, make it grow. By forging my signature, I interrupted, without my knowledge or consent. We knew you'd worry unnecessarily, Jennifer jumped in, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. You've been so stressed about finances lately, and we didn't want to burden you with complicated investment decisions. I almost laughed at the audacity. You didn't want to burden me with decisions about my own money and my own property? You have to admit, Betty, that financial planning isn't really your strong suit. Jennifer continued. Marcus and I have more experience with modern investment strategies. We were trying to protect you from making mistakes. There it was, the justification that every financial predator used when they stole from elderly victims. We were protecting you. We knew better than you. You're too old to understand. Protect me, I repeated, by committing multiple felonies, by planning to have me declared incompetent, by researching nursing homes to warehouse me when I became inconvenient to your theft. Marcus's expression hardened. Mom, you're being dramatic. No one was trying to hurt you. The nursing home brochures in Jennifer's jewelry box suggest otherwise. Jennifer's mouth fell open. You went through my personal belongings? In my house, I said. The house you were planning to steal through mortgage fraud. For several minutes we stared at each other across the kitchen table. Everything was out in the open now. Their crimes, their plans, their complete lack of remorse for what they'd been willing to do to me. So what happens now? Marcus asked, his voice taking on an edge of defiance. I sat back down, pulled out my phone, and showed them Patricia Chen's contact information. Now you learn about consequences, I said. I've already documented everything you've done with an attorney who specializes in elder fraud. The evidence is comprehensive enough to result in federal charges for both of you. You're going to have your own son arrested, Marcus asked, and for the first time I heard something that might have been real emotion in his voice. I'm going to protect myself from people who were planning to steal my life savings and have me committed to a nursing home, I replied. The fact that those people happen to be my son and daughter-in-law makes it heartbreaking, not excusable. Jennifer was crying now, but they were angry tears, not remorseful ones. This is insane, Betty. We're family. Families work together, they share resources. Families don't forge signatures, I interrupted. Families don't commit fraud. Families don't plan to have each other declared incompetent for financial gain. I stood up again, gathering the evidence back into its folder. You have 24 hours to pack your belongings and leave my house. If you're not gone by tomorrow evening, I'm calling the police and filing formal charges. Where are we supposed to go? Marcus demanded. That's not my problem, I said. You're adults who chose to commit crimes instead of getting jobs and taking care of yourselves. Figure it out. You can't just throw us out, Jennifer shouted. We have rights. I smiled. The same cold smile I'd learned from watching attorneys destroy criminals who thought they were smarter than the legal system. Actually, you don't. This is my house, which I own free and clear. You are guests who have overstayed your welcome and committed felonies against your host. You have no rights here except the right to leave voluntarily before I have you arrested. Marcus was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Mom, I never thought you'd... we're family. We were family, I corrected. Family members don't try to steal each other's homes. What you are now are criminals who made the mistake of targeting someone who knows exactly how the legal system handles fraud cases. I walked toward the kitchen door, then turned back for one final look at the two people who'd been planning to destroy my life for money. 24 hours, I repeated. Use that time to think about whether you want to leave quietly and hope I decide not to press charges, or whether you want to find out what happens when elder fraud cases go to trial. As I walked away, I heard Jennifer whisper to Marcus, "She's bluffing. She wouldn't really have us arrested." They still didn't understand who they were dealing with. They still thought this 60-year-old Wolin was too soft, too sentimental, too attached to family to follow through on protecting herself from their crimes. They were about to learn that the most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating someone whose life you've tried to steal. 24 hours later, Marcus and Jennifer were still in my house, apparently having decided that I was bluffing about the consequences of their fraud. They'd spent the day acting like nothing had happened, lounging in my living room and eating my food while making no effort to pack or find somewhere else to live. That evening, I made good on my promise. I called. "I need to report identity theft and attempted mortgage fraud," I told the dispatcher. "The perpetrators are currently in my home, and I have complete documentation of their crimes." 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes, followed shortly by Detective Sarah Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit, who had worked with my former law firm on several elder fraud cases and knew me by reputation. "Mrs. White," Detective Rodriguez said as she reviewed the evidence I'd compiled, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented fraud cases I've ever seen. You've essentially done our job for us." The arrest was swift and professional. Marcus and Jennifer were read their rights and taken into custody on charges of attempted fraud, forgery, and identity theft. As they were led away in handcuffs, Marcus looked back at me with an expression of shock that he was actually facing consequences for his actions. "Mom, you can't be serious about this," he called out. "We're family." "Family members don't try to steal each other's homes," I replied, the same words I'd used during our confrontation. The next morning, Patricia Chen called with an update on the legal proceedings. "Betty, the district attorney's office is very interested in this case. They're seeing an increase in family-based elder fraud, and they want to make an example of prosecutions. Marcus and Jennifer are looking at potential sentences of 5–10 years if they're convicted. What are my options?" I asked. "Well, they'll probably try to negotiate a plea bargain. Community service, restitution, probation. The question is whether you're willing to accept a lighter sentence in exchange for avoiding a trial." I thought about Marcus's complete lack of remorse, about Jennifer's research into nursing homes, about their months of planning to steal my life savings and have me declared incompetent. "I want to send a message," I said, "not just to them, but to anyone else who thinks elderly homeowners are easy targets for this kind of fraud. Then we push for the maximum sentence and make sure the case gets media attention. Other families need to know that elder fraud has serious consequences." The case did indeed attract media attention. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "Son and Daughter-in-Law Arrested for Attempting to Defraud Elderly Mother," which was picked up by the Associated Press and shared nationally. I received dozens of letters from other elderly homeowners who'd experienced similar attempts by family members to steal their assets. Many of them had been too embarrassed or too afraid to report the crimes. My case gave them the courage to protect themselves. But the most satisfying part wasn't the media attention or the letters of support. It was the phone call I received from Marcus after he'd spent 3 days in jail waiting for his bail hearing. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice different than I'd ever heard it. Smaller, ashamed, finally understanding the gravity of what he'd done. "I'll visit you after you're sentenced," I replied, and hung up. 6 months later, Marcus was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for fraud and identity theft. Jennifer received 2 years in supervised probation. Both were ordered to pay restitution covering my legal costs and the time I'd spent dealing with their crime. The day after the sentencing, I did something I'd been planning since the morning I discovered their loan application. I completely redecorated their former bedroom. I painted the walls a cheerful yellow, bought new furniture, and turned it into an art studio, something I'd always wanted, but never had room for, while my house was occupied by people who'd been planning to steal it. I also updated my will, removing Marcus as a beneficiary and leaving my estate to a legal aid foundation that helps elderly victims of family financial fraud. If Marcus ever gets out of prison and reforms his character, he can rebuild our relationship based on honesty and respect. But my assets will be protected from any future attempts at manipulation. A year after the arrests, I received an unexpected visitor, Jennifer, who'd been released from prison after serving 18 months of her sentence. "Betty, I came to apologize," she said, standing nervously on my front porch. the porch of the house she'd once planned to steal. "I'm listening," I said, but I didn't invite her in. "I know you have no reason to forgive me, but I want you to know that prison gave me time to understand how wrong we were. We convinced ourselves that we were helping you, but we were really just being greedy and selfish." She looked genuinely remorseful, but I'd learned not to trust appearances when it came to people who'd already proven they could lie and manipulate for months without showing any guilt. "What do you want, Jennifer?" "Nothing," she said, which surprised me. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry and thank you." "Thank me?" "For pressing charges, for not letting us get away with it. If you'd just kicked us out and let it go, we probably would have tried the same thing with someone else's family. Prison taught us that our actions have consequences, and that lesson probably saved us from becoming even worse people." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. What I saw was someone who looked older, sadder, and possibly wiser than the woman who'd spent hours practicing my signature. "I hope that's true," I said, "but forgiveness and trust are different things. You're welcome to rebuild your life and become a better person, but you'll do it somewhere else, with other people." Jennifer nodded. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that some good came from your decision to hold us accountable." After she left, I sat in my art studio, surrounded by canvases and paints and the smell of creativity that filled the space where two criminals had once planned my financial destruction. I thought about the choices that had led to that moment, my decision to investigate rather than ignore the warning signs, my refusal to let family loyalty override my need for justice, my determination to protect not just myself but other potential victims. Most importantly, I thought about the lesson this experience had taught me about the difference between love and enabling, between family loyalty and being victimized by people who shared your DNA. I'd lost my son, at least temporarily, but I'd kept my house, my independence, my financial security, and my self-respect. I'd also sent a message to other would-be elder fraud perpetrators that some victims fight back, and some fights end with prison sentences. At 61 years old, living alone in the house I'd fought to keep, I was happier and more secure than I'd been in months. My art studio was filled with natural light, my bank account was protected from thieves, and my future was mine to determine. Marcus could rebuild our relationship when he got out of prison, if he chose to do the work of becoming someone trustworthy. But it would be a relationship between equals, built on honesty and respect, not one where I was expected to be grateful for not being robbed by my own family. Sometimes the best thing you can do for people you love is to show them that there are consequences for hurting you. Sometimes justice is the most loving response to betrayal. And sometimes the most dangerous thing criminals can do is underestimate a 60-year-old woman who knows the legal system, values her independence, and refuses to be a victim just because the people trying to victimize her happen to be family. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I was standing in my fully renovated art studio, preparing for my first solo art exhibition in over 30 years. The room that had once housed two people planning to steal my house was now filled with paintings that represented my journey from victim to survivor to someone who'd found new purpose in protecting others. The exhibition, titled Reclaimed Spaces, Art from Adversity, would feature 20 paintings inspired by my experience with elder fraud, along with information about recognizing and reporting financial crimes against seniors. Half the proceeds would go to the legal aid foundation I'd chosen as my heir, and the other half would fund a victim advocacy program I'd helped establish. But the exhibition wasn't just about my art. It had attracted the attention of news media, legal advocates, and other families dealing with similar situations. I'd become an inadvertent expert on elder financial fraud, speaking at conferences and consulting with law enforcement agencies about family-based financial crimes. The morning before the exhibition opening, I received a call that brought the entire experience full circle. "Mrs. White, this is Detective Martinez from the San Diego Police Department. We have a case that's almost identical to what you experienced with your son and daughter-in-law. The victim's daughter saw your story in the news and asked if you'd be willing to speak with her mother." "Of course," I said. "What's the situation?" 73-year-old homeowner, living with her son and his wife, They've been forging her signature on loan applications and credit card accounts. The son convinced her she was becoming forgetful and needed him to manage her finances. She was about to sign power of attorney documents when her daughter intervened. It was the same pattern: gradual isolation, financial manipulation, fake concern about the victim's mental capacity, and a systematic plan to gain control of assets. The same playbook that Marcus and Jennifer had used, probably learned from online forums or criminal networks that specialized in targeting elderly family members. Is she willing to press charges? I asked. That's what we're hoping you can help with. She's afraid of destroying her relationship with her son, and she's not sure she has enough evidence to prove what he's been doing. 3 days later, I was in San Diego, sitting across from Helen Martinez, a retired teacher, whose story was heartbreakingly similar to my own. Her son had moved in after a job loss, gradually taken over her mail and financial management, and convinced her that she was becoming too confused to handle money matters independently. "Mrs. White," Helen said, her voice shaking, "I keep thinking that maybe I am getting forgetful. Maybe I did agree to those credit card applications and just don't remember. Maybe my son is right that I need more help than I realized." I recognized the voice of someone who'd been systematically gaslighted by people she trusted, made to doubt her own memory and judgment by criminals who benefited from her confusion. "Helen, let me ask you something," I said. "When you taught school, were you good at recognizing when students were lying to you?" "Oh yes. After 30 years in the classroom, you develop a sixth sense about deception. And when you managed your household finances all those years, were you careful about balancing your checkbook and paying bills on time?" "Very careful. I never missed a payment or bounced a check." "So why would you suddenly become careless about financial decisions at the same time your son moved in and started helping you?" Helen was quiet for a moment, and I could see her connecting the dots between her lifelong competence and her son's sudden claims that she needed financial management. "You think he's been lying to me about my capabilities to make his theft seem justified?" she said finally. "I think your son is using exactly the same techniques that my son used," I replied, "making you doubt yourself, isolating you from other perspectives, creating dependency so you'll be grateful for his help, even when that help involves stealing your asset." I spent the next 2 hours walking Helen through the evidence collection process I'd used, showing her how to document financial irregularities, how to verify whether signatures were genuine, and how to build a case that would protect her from further exploitation. "But what if I'm wrong?" Helen asked. "What if I really am becoming forgetful and I'm just being paranoid?" "Then you'll have gathered evidence that proves your son is innocent, and you can apologize," I said. "But if you're right, you'll have prevented him from stealing your life savings and potentially targeting other elderly relatives." 3 months later, Helen called with an update that was both predictable and heartbreaking. The evidence she'd gathered proved that her son had stolen over $80,000 through forged signatures and unauthorized credit accounts. When confronted, he'd responded exactly like Marcus, denying the evidence, claiming he was trying to help, and expressing outrage that his own mother would betray him by investigating his activities. "I pressed charges," Helen told me. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I kept thinking about what you said, that enabling his crimes wouldn't help him become a better person." "How do you feel about the decision?" I asked. "Sad, but not sorry. He needs to face consequences for what he's done, and I need to protect myself from further theft. Prison might be the wake-up call he needs to understand that his actions hurt real people." Helen's case was one of 12 similar situations I consulted on over the next 2 years. Each family had the same dynamics: adult children moving in with elderly parents under the guise of providing help, gradually taking control of financial decisions, and eventually committing fraud while convincing their victims that the theft was justified by the victim's supposed incompetence. But not every case ended with successful prosecution. Some elderly victims were too afraid, too ashamed, or too emotionally attached to their criminal children to follow through with legal action. I learned that my willingness to press charges against Marcus had been unusual. Most family financial fraud cases ended with the criminals facing no consequences and moving on to other victims. That realization led to the most important work of my later years, developing educational programs to help elderly homeowners recognize and prevent family-based financial fraud before it happened. The key, I would tell audiences at senior centers and community meetings, is understanding that criminals who target elderly victims often use family relationships as weapons against us. They exploit our love, our trust, and our desire to help our children, turning those positive emotions into tools for theft. I developed what I called the Family Financial Safety Protocol, a set of guidelines that elderly homeowners could use to protect themselves. Never sign documents you haven't read completely and understood fully, even if they're presented by family members. Never give anyone power of attorney without consulting an independent attorney who represents only your interests. Keep copies of all financial documents in a location that family members can't access or alter. Maintain relationships with people outside your household who can provide objective perspectives on family financial decisions. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong, even if the people you suspect are people you love. Remember, I would conclude these presentations, the people who steal from elderly family members are counting on us to choose family loyalty over self-protection. They want us to believe that pressing charges or seeking help would be a betrayal of family bonds. But the real betrayal is committed by the people who use our trust against us. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, I received a letter that changed my perspective on everything that had happened. It was from Marcus himself, written from federal prison, where he was serving the final months of his sentence. "Mom," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you after what Jennifer and I did. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. But I've been working with a counselor here who specializes in financial crimes, and I needed to tell you some things I should have said 5 years ago. First, I want to apologize. Not the fake apology I tried to give when you first discovered what we'd done, but a real one. What Jennifer and I did was theft, pure and simple. We stole your identity, forged your signature, and planned to steal your house. There's no justification for any of it, and I'm ashamed that it took prison and 5 years of reflection to understand how completely wrong we were. Second, I want to thank you for pressing charges. I know that sounds strange, but the counselor helped me understand that if you'd let us get away with defrauding you, we probably would have tried similar schemes with other people. Prison has been hard, but it's also been educational. I've learned about the psychology of financial criminals, and I've come to understand that what we did wasn't desperate people making bad decisions. It was predatory behavior that would have escalated if you hadn't stopped us. I've been following news stories about your advocacy work, and I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built from our betrayal, the families you've helped, the fraud cases you've prevented, the educational programs you've developed. They're all positive outcomes that came from your decision to fight back instead of just accepting victimization. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect you to want a relationship with me when I get out. But I want you to know that the woman who raised me to understand right from wrong is still in there somewhere, and she taught her son lessons that he finally learned, even if it took prison to make them stick. If you're ever willing to see me again, I'd like the chance to show you that I've been who you taught me to be. But if not, I understand, and I'll respect your decision. Your son, Marcus. I read the letter 3 times before deciding how to respond. The tone was different from any communication I'd received from Marcus since childhood. Humble, accountable, and focused on acknowledging harm rather than minimizing it. But letters were easy to write. The real test would be whether Marcus's actions matched his words when he was released and faced with the temptation to return to criminal behavior. 6 months later, Marcus was released from federal prison. I knew because his parole officer contacted me as part of his supervision requirements. Marcus had requested permission to contact me, and the parole officer needed to confirm that I was comfortable with supervised communication. "Mrs. White, your son has participated in our financial crimes rehabilitation program, and his counselors believe he's made genuine progress. But the final decision about contact is entirely yours." "What kind of contact is he requesting?" I asked. "Initially, just phone calls. Eventually, if things go well, he'd like to visit in person. but he's made it clear that he understands you might not be interested in rebuilding the relationship. I thought about Helen Martinez and the other elderly victims I'd worked with, many of whom struggled with the question of whether to give criminal family members second chances. The answer, I'd learned, depended entirely on whether the criminal had genuinely changed, or was simply saying what they thought their victim wanted to hear. "I'll accept one phone call," I told the parole officer, "but it will be recorded. If Marcus tries to manipulate, guilt trip, or make excuses for what he did, that will be the end of our communication." The phone call took place 2 weeks later, with the parole officer monitoring and recording the conversation. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice older and more serious than I remembered. "Thank you for giving me this chance to talk to you." "What do you want to tell me?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I want to tell you that I understand now what Jennifer and I did to you, and why you had respond the way you did. We didn't just try to steal your money, we tried to steal your independence, your dignity, and your right to control your own life. We used your love for me against you, and we made you doubt your own judgment and capabilities." This was more insight than Marcus had ever shown about the psychological impact of his crimes. "We convinced ourselves that we were helping you, that you needed financial guidance, that we knew better than you did about your own money. But what we really did was decide that your assets belonged to us and that your autonomy was inconvenient to our plans." "Why did you do it?" I asked. "You had a college education. You were capable of getting jobs. You had opportunities that I sacrificed to give you. Why choose theft over honest work?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Because honest work felt slow and uncertain, and stealing from you felt easy and guaranteed. We told ourselves that you were old, that you wouldn't live forever, that the money would be ours eventually anyway, so taking it early wasn't really stealing." The honesty was brutal, but it was more than I'd ever heard from him before. Prison taught me that those thoughts, that elderly people's assets, are somehow less legitimate, that our financial independence is temporary, and therefore dispensable. Those are the thoughts that drive most elder financial crime. Criminals don't see elderly victims as real people with rights and needs. They see us as resources to be harvested. "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that what we did was attempted murder. Not physical murder, but the murder of your independence, your security, your ability to control your own future. We were trying to kill the person you'd worked your whole life to become and replace her with a dependent victim who existed for our benefit." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Marcus answering every question I asked about his crimes, his motivation, and his understanding of the impact on me. He never made excuses, never suggested that his actions were justified by circumstances, never tried to rush me toward forgiveness or reconciliation. At the end of the call, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, I know you've become an advocate for elder fraud victims, and I want you to know that I support that work completely. If there's ever a way for me to contribute to preventing other families from going through what we put you through, I'm willing to do that, even if it means publicly admitting what I did and facing the shame that comes with it." 6 months later, Marcus made good on that offer. He agreed to be interviewed for a documentary about family financial fraud, sharing his story and explaining the psychology that led him to target his own mother. The documentary, titled Stolen Trust: When Families Become Predators, aired on PBS and became a powerful educational tool for other families. But the most meaningful moment came a year after that, when Marcus attended one of my educational presentations at a senior center in Sacramento. He sat in the back row, listening to me describe the warning signs of family financial fraud, and afterward approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, watching you teach people to protect themselves from criminals like me, I'm proud of who you became after we tried to destroy you. You turned our betrayal into something that helps other families avoid the same trauma." "I had a choice," I replied. "I could let what you did make me bitter and suspicious everyone, or I could use the experience to help other people recognize and stop similar crimes. I chose to let it make me stronger and more useful." "Do you think we'll ever have a real relationship again?" Marcus asked. I looked at my son, older, humbler, and possibly wiser than the man who'd forged my signature 5 years earlier. and realized that this conversation was the relationship, not the mother-son bond of his childhood, but an adult relationship between two people who'd survived a terrible betrayal and found ways to build something positive from its wreckage. "We're having a real relationship right now," I said. "It's not the relationship I expected to have with my adult son, but it's honest, it's accountable, and it's based on who we really are rather than who we pretend to be." Marcus nodded, understanding that this was both more and less than he might have hoped for, but also more than he'd had any right to expect. "I love you, Mom, and I'm sorry it took losing you to learn how much damage I was willing to do to the people I claim to love." "I love you too," I said. "But love and trust are different things, and trust has to be earned through actions over time, not words in a single conversation." That night, I sat in my art studio, the room that had once housed two people planning to steal my house, surrounded by paintings that told the story of betrayal, survival, and recovery. Tomorrow, I would teach another group of elderly homeowners how to protect themselves from family financial fraud. Next week, I would consult on another case involving adult children stealing from aging parents. But tonight, I reflected on the unexpected gift that Marcus's betrayal had given me. The understanding that my most important work wasn't behind me, but ahead of me. That the experience and wisdom I'd gained from surviving family financial fraud could be used to protect other families from similar trauma. At 65 years old, living alone in the house I'd fought to keep, I was more purposeful and more fulfilled than I'd ever been. My son was rebuilding his life based on honesty rather than theft. My advocacy work was preventing other elderly people from being victimized by their own families. My art was telling stories that needed to be told. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you ever do. Sometimes betrayal teaches you strengths you didn't know you had, and sometimes the people who try to destroy your life accidentally show you who you really are and what you're really capable of achieving. This story isn't just about one woman's fight against family financial fraud. It's about recognizing that age doesn't make us vulnerable to deception. It gives us the experience to recognize it, the wisdom to document it, and the strength to fight back against it. If someone in your family starts taking control of your finances, questions your mental capacity, or tries to isolate you from independent financial advice, remember this story. Remember that criminals often use family bonds as weapons against their victims, and that protecting yourself from theft isn't a betrayal of family loyalty. It's a necessary act of self-preservation. And remember that the most dangerous mistake any criminal can make is underestimating a victim who understands that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is to show them that there are consequences for hurting you. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Betty White, reminding you that your house, your money, and your independence belong to you, regardless of what your family members might think they deserve. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because experience is the best teacher, and some lessons are too important to learn the hard way.